She stepped into first class, and the air changed. Not in any obvious way, no gasps, no sudden silence, but in the small things. The way conversation slowed, the way a man glanced up from his newspaper, the way a woman clutched her designer bag just a little tighter. It was the kind of reaction she had seen all her life, the kind reserved for people like her in places like this. She walked with quiet confidence, but it didn't matter. Her skin had already spoken for her. She wasn't what they expected in first class. She wasn't what they wanted, and no one made that clearer than Clarissa Vaughn. Clarissa had greeted every other passenger with warmth, her smiles practiced, her voice smooth. But the moment she stepped forward, the welcome turned cold. The politeness stayed, but there was something beneath it, a challenge, a dismissal, a question that didn't need to be spoken aloud. "Are you sure you belong here?" Clarissa didn't say the words. She didn't have to. They were in every action that followed. The hesitation before checking her ticket. The way she spoke a little too slowly, like explaining something to a child. The way she made sure that, from the moment the flight took off, she would never forget that she was out of place. A missing drink order, a mix-up with the seat assignment, a tray of food that just happened to spill. Small things, little things, but they built on each other, piling higher and higher, meant to push her down until she broke, until she gave in, until she disappeared. But some people don't disappear so easily. And what happens when the woman you tried to erase turns out to be someone you should have never crossed? This is a story about power, arrogance, and the moment everything changes. Watch as the people who thought they were in control realize, too late, that they made the worst mistake of their lives. If you love stories of instant karma, like, subscribe, and comment below. Have you ever witnessed injustice like this? What would you have done? And where are you watching from? Let us know. Marlene stepped into the first-class cabin with quiet dignity, moving at a steady pace, though her body carried the weight of time. The space exuded luxury, polished wood panels, dim golden lighting, the scent of fresh leather and expensive cologne. Every detail was designed to make passengers feel exclusive. But as she approached, Clarissa Vaughn, standing just beyond the threshold, had already decided Marlene didn't belong. The flight attendant's eyes flickered with something cold and dismissive, but she schooled her face into a polite mask. "Good evening, ma'am," she said, her voice smooth but distant. "Are you lost?" Marlene, unfazed, pulled out her ticket and handed it over without hesitation. C2A. Clarissa took the boarding pass between two fingers, as if it were something fragile, and barely glanced at it before an amused smirk curled at the corner of her lips. "Oh," she murmured, voice laced with something too mild to be outright disrespect, yet sharp enough to sting. She handed the pass back, not returning it to Marlene's palm, but rather dropping it onto the counter beside her. "I see. Well, let's get you settled." Marlene bent slightly to retrieve the ticket, her movements still controlled, but the gesture was not lost on her. Clarissa had deliberately chosen not to return it properly, a tiny power play disguised as carelessness. Clarissa turned toward the first-class seats and took a slow step forward. But then, as if struck by a sudden thought, she stopped short, pressing a finger to her headset. "Oh dear," she said to no one in particular. "There might be an issue." Marlene remained silent, but she could feel the shift in atmosphere. Clarissa hummed, tapping at her tablet, pretending to scan something. "It looks like your ticket might have been flagged, possibly a system error." She exhaled as if this were a great inconvenience. "I'm going to have to verify this before I can let you through." Marlene's hands remained folded neatly in front of her, her face unreadable. "I booked this flight weeks ago." Clarissa lifted a brow, her expression betraying nothing. "I'm sure you did, ma'am. We just need to double-check." Behind Marlene, passengers were still boarding, filing in smoothly. Clarissa ignored them all, her full attention locked onto delaying Marlene, ensuring she stood there longer than necessary, ensuring that each passing traveler saw her. A couple approached the entrance, middle-aged, well-dressed, radiating quiet wealth. Clarissa's demeanor changed instantly. "Mr. and Mrs. Belmont," she greeted, her voice now warm, welcoming. "Right this way." She stepped aside effortlessly, allowing them to pass without even checking their tickets. Marlene remained standing. A businessman, noticing the scene, spared her a glance. His expression was unreadable, but not unkind. "Is everything all right?" Clarissa turned to him with flawless professionalism, adjusting her tone just enough to imply nothing was wrong. But something could be. "Oh, just a minor mix-up with seat assignments. Happens sometimes when bookings get complicated." Marlene's jaw tensed at the implication. The businessman hesitated, as if considering pressing the matter, but in the end, he simply nodded and moved on. Clarissa let a few more passengers pass, ensuring the pause dragged on, letting Marlene stand there just a little longer, before finally making a small noise of mock relief. Seems like everything is in order after all. My mistake." She stepped aside with a smile, motioning toward the seats. "Right this way." Marlene walked past her without a word, though she knew Clarissa was still watching, still gauging her reaction. She wouldn't give her this satisfaction. As she made her way down the aisle, she could feel curious eyes on her, some indifferent, some subtly judging. The whispered remarks barely reached her ears, but she knew they were there. Clarissa, trailing behind, added one final touch. "It's so wonderful seeing more diversity in first class these days," she mused, just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. The words were carefully crafted, not overtly offensive, but deeply patronizing. A few passengers chuckled quietly. Marlene took her seat, adjusting herself carefully, her hands resting lightly on the armrests. The moment she had sat down, Clarissa vanished, moving down the aisle to tend to other guests, as if nothing had happened at all. But something had. Clarissa had done nothing explicitly cruel. No raised voice, no harsh words. But she had turned Marlene into a spectacle, planted the seed of doubt in the minds of everyone who had seen the scene unfold. And worst of all, she had done it all with a smile. Marlene took a slow breath, steadying herself. The flight hadn't even taken off yet. Marlene adjusted herself in the tight seat Clarissa had forced upon her, hands folded neatly in her lap, jaw set in quiet restraint. The murmurs hadn't stopped since she was displaced from her rightful seat. Every now and then, she caught a glance, some curious, some indifferent, but most dripping with unspoken judgment. She had been here before, in boardrooms filled with men who believed she had no place at their table. But this was different. This wasn't corporate maneuvering or cutthroat competition. This was simple, blatant humiliation. Clarissa, lingering a few rows ahead, seemed to decide the moment wasn't over yet. With a practiced flick of her hair, she turned toward the passengers, her voice carrying just loud enough to ensure no one missed what she was about to say. "Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen," she called, her tone falsely pleasant. "We seem to have a small seating confusion." Her eyes deliberately found Marlene's. "Our dear passenger here appears to have mistakenly booked first class. If anyone would be so kind as to offer her a more suitable seat in economy, we'd be very grateful." Heads turned. Conversations died down. The hum of the cabin air suddenly felt deafening. Marlene could feel every stare piercing through her. A few passengers shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with the situation, but unwilling to speak up. Others smirked behind raised champagne glasses. One man, a portly executive type in a tailored navy suit, let out a scoff, shaking his head. "They'll let just about anyone in here these days." A younger woman near the front, dressed in casual designer wear, frowned slightly. "But if she has a ticket, why does she need to move?" Clarissa, as if anticipating the question, plastered on a rehearsed smile. "Oh, there's no problem at all. We just want to ensure everyone has the most comfortable experience possible. And let's be honest," she gave a small chuckle, "some passengers might find first class a bit overwhelming." The meaning was clear. Marlene felt the weight of the statement settle on her like a lead blanket. The young woman hesitated, but ultimately turned back to her phone, unwilling to press further. The executive in the navy suit leaned forward, glancing at Marlene as if seeing an intruder in his space. Maybe she's someone's grandmother using a gifted ticket. Happens all the time. A few passengers chuckled, the kind of quiet laughter meant to sting. Clarissa, pleased, gave an apologetic shrug. Well, we do our best to accommodate all types of travelers. Her gaze flicked back to Marlene. We just want her to have a smooth experience, without any discomfort. The word lingered in the air like a taunt. Without discomfort, as if her presence was the discomfort. A long silence stretched, the moment teetering between resolution and further escalation. Then, with an exaggerated sigh, Clarissa turned to her colleague near the service cart. Sasha, could you double-check if there are any open seats in economy? It's probably best we just relocate her to avoid any confusion. Sasha hesitated, her hands gripping the handle of the cart. There aren't any open seats. Clarissa's lips thinned, though her irritation was brief. She turned back to the passengers, shrugging as if helpless. Well, she said, her voice sweet with venom, looks like she's staying. The way she said it made it clear, this was a pity, not a right. Marlene, still silent, felt the pressure of every unspoken judgment around her. She had spent decades proving her worth in rooms full of men who underestimated her. But here, in this moment, stripped of title and power, she was nothing more than an old woman being granted a favor. Clarissa wasn't done. She turned back to Sasha. Make sure she gets extra assistance during the flight. I wouldn't want her to struggle with the first-class amenities. Another chuckle rippled through the cabin. Sasha's face burned with discomfort, but she nodded. Of course. Clarissa, satisfied, finally moved on. The conversation resumed, passengers returning to their champagne and business calls, but the damage was done. Marlene kept her back straight, eyes locked on the seat in front of her, fingers intertwined on her lap. The whispers around her had died down, but the weight of judgment lingered in the air like a thick fog. The first-class cabin had returned to its indulgent routine, flight attendants pouring champagne, businessmen flipping through stock reports, designer bags tucked neatly beneath seats. To them, she was already forgotten. Clarissa, however, wasn't done. She strolled down the aisle, stopping near Marlene's seat with a thoughtful hum. You know, she mused, tapping her manicured nails against the leather headrest of an empty first-class seat, since there was so much confusion earlier. I think it's only fair that we make sure everyone is exactly where they belong. Her eyes flicked to the young man standing near the galley, a well-dressed passenger in his early 30s, effortlessly confident, the kind of man who fits seamlessly into a world of privilege. Mr. Jennings, Clarissa called, flashing a smile, since you were upgraded last minute. Would you mind taking seat 2A? It's one of our best. The man blinked, glancing toward the seat in question, Marlene's original seat. Marlene's posture stiffened. She knew what was coming before Clarissa even turned toward her. Mrs. Hargrove, Clarissa sighed, voice dripping with false patience. Would you be willing to switch seats? Mr. Jennings was just moved to first class, and we want to give him the best experience possible. I'm sure you understand. Marlene finally looked up, her expression unreadable. I was already asked to move once. Clarissa's smile didn't falter. Yes, but this is different. This is about hospitality. Jennings hesitated, clearly sensing the tension. I don't mind. Oh, nonsense, Clarissa cut in smoothly. We want you to be comfortable. She turned back to Marlene. And let's be honest, you might find a different seat more suited to your needs. Marlene didn't respond. She wasn't given a chance. Clarissa gestured toward an inferior seat in the last row of first class, a cramped spot next to the aisle where flight attendants frequently passed. We have a wonderful seat right there. Still first class, of course, just more convenient for everyone. A few passengers looked up now, sensing the quiet spectacle unfolding before them. Jennings shifted awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with being placed in the middle of something that felt wrong. Marlene held his gaze for a moment before slowly rising from her seat. She wasn't given a choice. Clarissa clapped her hands together. Wonderful. Thank you for being so understanding. Marlene moved with careful, deliberate steps, head held high even as the heat of humiliation burned beneath her skin. She sank into the new seat, stiff and unyielding, feeling the claustrophobia of her reduced space pressing in on her. Jennings took her former seat, glancing at her once more before shifting uncomfortably in place. Clarissa wasn't done. She turned back to Marlene, hands on her hips, eyes expectant. "Oh, one last thing," she said brightly, as if she had almost forgotten. "Would you mind apologizing for the confusion? We wouldn't want any misunderstandings lingering." Marlene's hands curled into fists in her lap. The air thickened with silence. Passengers turned away, suddenly interested in their magazines, their meals, their own thoughts. No one spoke up. No one intervened. Clarissa's smile sharpened. "Mrs. Hargrove?" Marlene's throat tightened, but her voice remained steady. "I apologize for any inconvenience." Clarissa beamed, tilting her head. "See? That wasn't so hard." She gave a satisfied nod before striding away, leaving Marlene in the suffocating quiet of her diminished place. Clarissa passed by more than once, never looking at Marlene directly, but each time, she let her shoulder brush just slightly against her arm, a small, calculated reminder that she was in the way. Other passengers were comfortably reclining, sipping champagne, enjoying the curated elegance of the flight. Marlene sat rigid, hands in her lap, waiting. Soon, Clarissa reappeared, this time pushing the food cart, her expression perfectly neutral. She served each passenger with flawless precision, smiling, engaging in effortless small talk. When she reached Marlene, her movements slowed. "Mrs. Hargrove," she said, voice dripping with manufactured politeness. "We have a lovely selection today. I assume you'd prefer something soft? Maybe soup." She let the words linger, an unmistakable jab at Marlene's age. Marlene met her gaze, expression unreadable. "I'll take the chicken." Clarissa lifted a brow, as if surprised, but she said nothing. She took the meal tray and for the briefest moment, hovered it above Marlene's lap before setting it down in front of her with a little more force than necessary. "Enjoy." Marlene reached for her utensils, but before she could take a single bite, Clarissa jerked the cart suddenly, feigning a misstep. The tray tilted. A split second later, scalding hot gravy and mashed potatoes spilled straight onto Marlene's lap. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Clarissa's hands flew to her mouth in mock horror. "Oh dear," she exclaimed, her voice carrying just enough for nearby passengers to hear. "That was so clumsy of me. I'm so sorry." Marlene inhaled sharply, the heat searing through the fabric of her slacks. The discomfort was immediate, but the humiliation was worse. The mess clung to her, staining her clothes, the sticky warmth a suffocating presence. Passengers nearby glanced over, but quickly looked away, unwilling to involve themselves. Clarissa sighed dramatically. "I knew I should have been more careful with you." She shook her head as if she were the victim in all of this, as if she were the one inconvenienced. "Bumps like that can be so unexpected. But you know that, right?" A small, knowing smile tugged at her lips. "At your age, I imagine you've had your fair share of little accidents." The words landed heavier than the food on Marlene's lap. Clarissa turned to Sasha, the younger flight attendant assisting her. "Could you?" She paused, then smirked. "Actually, never mind." She reached for the stack of napkins, bunched them into a loose wad, and tossed them onto Marlene's lap. "There," she said. "You can clean yourself up. You're used to that, right?" The napkins bounced off Marlene's arms, landing unceremoniously on the mess in her lap. Not a single attempt to help her. The silence in the cabin was deafening. Sasha hesitated, shifting uncomfortably, her hands twitching as if wanting to intervene, but Clarissa shot her a warning glance. "Stay out of it." Marlene sat still for a long moment. Then, with steady hands, she picked up the napkins and began to wipe herself off, piece by piece, alone. Clarissa watched with thinly veiled satisfaction. "Oh, don't worry," she added, her voice light. "We'll bring you another tray if you're still hungry. I'm sure you don't mind eating a little later." A quiet, cruel laugh escaped from a passenger a few rows ahead. Someone else muttered, "What a mess." Marlene said nothing. Clarissa gave one last syrupy smile before pushing the cart forward, moving on as if nothing had happened. Marlene finished cleaning herself without assistance, her hands methodical, precise. She refused to look up, refused to let her gaze meet anyone else's. The stain on her pants wouldn't come out, But that wasn't the point. Clarissa pushed the food cart back into the galley. Her lips curled in satisfaction, but her eyes flicked back toward Marlene, who sat stiffly in her seat, the stain of spilled food still visible on her slacks. The old woman hadn't reacted much, hadn't lashed out, hadn't fought back, and that only made it more entertaining. Clarissa thrived on watching people shrink under pressure, and Marlene had already started to fold in on herself. Still, something about her silence irritated Clarissa. She wanted more. With a deliberate slowness, she grabbed an empty tray from the cart, turned on her heel, and sauntered back toward Marlene's row. Stopping just beside her, she let out a theatrical sigh. "Mrs. Hargrove," she said sweetly, holding up the tray just enough for nearby passengers to glance over. "Since you're already cleaning up after yourself, why don't you be a dear and help us out?" She extended the tray toward Marlene, the corners of her mouth twitching as she fought back a smirk. "I mean, I assume you're used to this kind of work." A few murmurs drifted through the cabin, the undercurrent of suppressed laughter clear. Marlene remained still, hands folded in her lap, eyes locked on the seat in front of her, as if refusing to acknowledge Clarissa's presence. Clarissa, unwilling to let her off that easy, tilted her head, her voice taking on an exaggerated concern. "Oh dear, did I overestimate you? At your age, I imagine heavy lifting isn't exactly ideal." The chuckles around them grew louder. A man across the aisle, a businessman with silver hair and a polished watch, smirked and leaned toward a seatmate. "Maybe she can't hear too well either," he muttered, just loud enough to be caught in the undertone of amusement filling the cabin. Clarissa feigned an apologetic wince, as if suddenly realizing her mistake. "Oh, of course. My apologies, Mrs. Hargrove," she said, her tone dripping with insincerity. "I shouldn't have assumed. I suppose hard work was never really your thing." She let her eyes linger on Marlene's clothes, then gave a soft, knowing chuckle. "Unless, of course, you had a career in service? Maybe a flight attendant, like me?" She gasped in mock realization, her free hand pressing against her chest. "Oh wait, don't tell me. You worked in aviation, didn't you?" Marlene's fingers twitched slightly, the only betrayal of emotion, but she didn't speak. Clarissa grinned, turning slightly to address the nearest passengers, as if sharing a delicious secret. "Can you imagine? 40 years in the industry. Now, that's dedication. Let me guess, Mrs. Hargrove, did you work the front desk? Count baggage tickets? Maybe push the drink cart like I do?" A low chuckle rolled through the rows. Someone, emboldened by the growing energy, chimed in, more like scrubbing the floors in the terminals. The laughter rippled outward, casual, effortless, cruel. Marlene inhaled, slow and measured, but Clarissa was already leaning in closer, lowering her voice just enough that only Marlene could hear. "Or maybe," she whispered, her breath warm against the air, "you were just one of those sad little people who pretended to have power while the real bosses made all the decisions." A silence settled between them, thick and suffocating. Marlene's jaw tightened, but her gaze remained forward, fixed and unyielding. Clarissa, unwilling to let the moment fade without a final push, tapped the tray against the side of the seat. "So Mrs. Hargrove," she said, voice bright and cheerful, "are you going to help out, or is that beneath you now?" Marlene didn't move. Clarissa let the pause stretch just long enough to make it uncomfortable, then sighed dramatically and straightened. "That's too bad," she mused, turning on her heel and sauntering back toward the galley, letting her voice carry over her shoulder. "I thought you'd at least want to relive the glory days." More laughter followed her departure, blending seamlessly into the sounds of clinking glasses and murmured conversations, as if nothing had happened at all. Marlene remained still, her breath steady, her expression unreadable, but something beneath her ribs tightened, a pressure that had nothing to do with the weight of the moment and everything to do with what she had lost. Clarissa hadn't just humiliated her in the present. She had reached back and ripped apart the very foundation of her past, shattering decades of work, of pride, of identity, and reduced them to nothing more than a joke. Clarissa had enjoyed herself far more than she expected, but there was always room for more. As the dinner service wrapped up, she made her way down the aisle with practiced ease, flashing pleasant smiles at the elite passengers while pointedly ignoring the woman she had reduced to a punchline. The perfect opportunity presented itself when she noticed Marlene rising slowly from her seat, steadying herself on the armrest before making her way toward the restroom at the front of the cabin. Clarissa paused, letting a cruel smirk ghost across her lips. Timing was everything. Marlene entered the lavatory, closing the door behind her. The moment the lock clicked, Clarissa moved swiftly, stepping forward and reaching into her pocket for a small, discreet security key, one that every flight attendant carried, allowing them to unlock lavatory doors from the outside. She turned the mechanism, then, with an almost lazy flick of her wrist, jammed the lock, sealing Marlene inside. The satisfaction settled deep in her chest. Minutes ticked by. Passengers came and went, but no one questioned the locked door. The longer Marlene stayed inside, the more ridiculous it would seem. The image was perfect. An old woman taking an eternity in the restroom, helpless, invisible, forgotten. At the 40-minute mark, someone finally asked. A woman near the front gestured toward the door. "Excuse me, is that occupied? It's been a while." Clarissa barely glanced up from her tablet. "Oh," she said lightly, a perfectly measured pause following. "Mrs. Hargrove went in earlier. You know how it is." The woman raised an eyebrow. "How what is?" Clarissa gave a delicate shrug, leaning in just slightly, lowering her voice as if sharing something embarrassing. "Older passengers sometimes take longer. I'm sure she'll be out soon." The woman's expression flickered between mild concern and distaste, but she said nothing. No one else pressed the issue. By the time an hour had passed, Marlene's patience had worn thin. She knocked on the inside of the door, testing the lock again, but it wouldn't budge. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a growing, quiet rage. She knocked harder. "Hello." Clarissa took her time. Let her knock. Let her wait. Let her feel the weight of helplessness settle on her. Finally, when she decided Marlene had spent enough time trapped, she strolled forward, feigning mild surprise as she rattled the door handle. "Oh dear, did the lock stick?" She twisted the key effortlessly, pulling the door open with exaggerated ease. "You must have jammed it, Mrs. Hargrove." Marlene could see it in Clarissa's eyes, the mocking glint, the way her lips twitched at the edges, the sheer enjoyment of watching her emerge humiliated. Before Marlene could step past her, Clarissa angled her body slightly, blocking the narrow space. "Actually," she murmured, just low enough that only Marlene could hear, "before you go back to your seat, I think you owe me something." Marlene stilled. Clarissa's voice remained light, casual, as if discussing the weather. "You were in there quite a while, you know. Had the whole cabin waiting." She cocked her head, fingers still lightly resting on the doorframe. "Don't you think you should apologize?" Passengers were watching. Marlene could feel it. Some weren't paying full attention, but a few nearby were eyeing the exchange, waiting to see what she would do. Clarissa smiled. "It's the polite thing, Mrs. Hargrove. A simple sorry for the trouble would be nice." Marlene's stomach twisted, not from shame, but from something deeper. Clarissa was forcing her to bow her head. Seconds stretched. Clarissa leaned in slightly, voice dropping just for Marlene to hear. "If you want to go back to your seat, that is." The moment hung heavy, suffocating. Marlene's fingers curled into invisible fists at her sides. Her breath was measured, controlled, but the humiliation pressed down on her like an unseen weight. Clarissa waited, smug and expectant. Marlene forced herself to meet her gaze. "Not yet," she told herself. "Not here." Her voice came out even quiet. "I'm sorry." Clarissa's smile widened, her victory complete. She stepped aside smoothly, gesturing toward the aisle. "See? That wasn't so hard." Marlene walked past her, shoulders squared, steps slow and steady. Clarissa watched her go, basking in the satisfaction. Marlene had just apologized for being trapped. Marlene returned to her seat, her movements measured, her body tense. But the moment she sat down, she could feel the eyes on her. The whispers had started again, hushed but sharp, slicing through the thick air of first class. Clarissa walked past her with a satisfied smirk, moving gracefully through the aisle as if nothing had happened. as if she hadn't just forced an apology from a woman she had locked away like a forgotten relic. Minutes passed, but the humiliation didn't fade. Clarissa made sure of that. Every time she passed, she made a point of stopping near Marlene, adjusting a tray, smoothing out an already neat blanket, making it obvious that she was still watching. Every now and then, a slight shake of her head, a quiet scoff, just enough for others to notice. Then, in a voice just loud enough for those around her to hear, she sighed. I think it's sad when people can't accept reality. She tapped a manicured nail against the cart, letting the moment stretch. Some people just don't know when their time is up. They cling to things that aren't meant for them anymore. A man across the aisle, still holding his whiskey glass, let out a low chuckle. You'd think she'd take the hint by now, he muttered to his seatmate. Clarissa hummed in agreement. Some people just can't let go, she mused, her voice laced with mock sympathy. Maybe it's because they used to be important, or at least they thought they were. She turned, letting her gaze fall directly on Marlene. But that was a long time ago. Marlene's grip on the armrest tightened. Clarissa leaned in slightly, her smile never faltering. Mrs. Hargrove, she said sweetly, do you still think you matter? The silence that followed was suffocating. Marlene didn't answer, but she didn't have to. The question itself was a sentence, a final stamp of degradation. Clarissa straightened, dusting off her uniform as if brushing away the remnants of an insignificant encounter. I suppose we all have our delusions, she said airily before turning away. But she wasn't done. Clarissa took a step toward the intercom, pressing a button discreetly. A moment later, a deep voice crackled through the speakers. Miss Vaughn, please report to the galley. With an exaggerated sigh, she turned toward the passengers, flashing an apologetic smile. Duty calls. She made her way toward the front, but not before giving Marlene one last look, the kind that said, you don't belong here. You never did. Minutes passed before Clarissa returned, but this time, she wasn't alone. 2 security officers followed, their expressions unreadable, their presence an undeniable shift in the atmosphere. The whispers in first class stopped entirely. Clarissa stood beside them, her hands neatly clasped in front of her, voice smooth as ever. Mrs. Hargrove, she said, as if delivering a polite request rather than a sentence, these gentlemen need to have a word with you. Marlene looked at them, then at her, and for the first time since this flight began, a flicker of steel entered her gaze. Clarissa smiled. You've been causing a bit of a disturbance, she continued lightly, her tone perfectly reasonable. Unfortunately, we can't allow that on a flight like this. It's for everyone's safety, you understand. A murmur ran through the cabin, the kind of silent judgment that came when people decided it was easier to accept what they were told than to question it. Marlene knew what was happening. Clarissa was removing her. Not because she had actually done anything wrong, but because it was the final step in stripping her of every last shred of dignity. One of the officers shifted slightly. Ma'am, we'd like to escort you off the plane. Clarissa tilted her head, feigning concern. Of course, if you'd just agree to quiet down and cooperate, I'm sure we could reconsider. Marlene understood the message beneath the words. Apologize again. Accept your place. Or leave. She held her ground. But for the first time, she felt the weight of every moment leading to this one pressing down on her. She had been humiliated, isolated, mocked, stripped of the past she had built, forced to apologize for existing. And now, they were taking the final thing left, her presence. Clarissa exhaled, as if disappointed. I really hoped we wouldn't have to do this. She turned to the officers, gesturing toward the aisle. Please escort her out. Clarissa stood tall, radiating confidence, as the security officers prepared to remove Marlene. The atmosphere in first class was heavy with expectation, the whispers growing as passengers watched, eager to see the troublesome old woman finally taken away. Marlene, however, remained still, her expression unreadable, her hands resting lightly on the armrests. The moment stretched, thick with finality, until a voice shattered it. Wait, a man called from the front of the cabin. His tone wasn't loud, but it carried the unmistakable weight of authority, slicing through the tension like a blade. Heads turned. A distinguished man in his 60s, sharp suit impeccable, eyes keen and calculating, had risen from his seat. He didn't look at Clarissa. His gaze was fixed on Marlene. A flicker of recognition passed over his face, followed by something colder, something dangerously close to fear. Clarissa, momentarily thrown off, forced a smile. "Sir, please remain seated. We are handling." "You're not handling anything," the man interrupted smoothly, his voice low but firm. "Do you even know who you're talking to?" Clarissa faltered, opening her mouth, then hesitating. Something in the man's posture, the way he carried himself, made her uneasy. But before she could react, another voice, sharper and more urgent, cut through the cabin. "Captain." The lead pilot appeared at the entrance of first class, his uniform crisp, but his face drained of color. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on Marlene, then darting toward the security report in the officer's hands. The moment he read her name, his expression twisted into something close to horror. His grip on the coffee cup tightened, then slipped entirely, sending porcelain shattering onto the floor. The sound made several passengers jump, but the pilot didn't react. His focus was solely on Marlene. Clarissa barely had time to register his reaction before he turned sharply toward the officers. "Stand down." Immediately, the command was absolute. The officers hesitated, glancing at each other, unsure, until the pilot's voice dropped into something razor-sharp. "Now." They stepped back. Clarissa's stomach twisted. "Captain, Shut up," the pilot snapped, his usual professionalism gone. Clarissa recoiled. The power dynamic in the cabin had shifted so fast it left her dizzy. Marlene, still silent, watched it unfold with a steady gaze. The businessman who had first spoken exhaled sharply, shaking his head, then turned to Clarissa, his tone laced with dark amusement. "Tell me something, Miss Vaughn. Do you have any idea who you've been humiliating for the past few hours?" Clarissa felt the blood drain from her face. She knew she had crossed lines, but the way he said it, the way everyone was looking at her now, made her skin crawl. "That's not," she started, but her voice faltered. The man didn't wait for her to finish. He turned to address the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce you to Marlene Hargrove." The name landed like a thunderclap. The shift was instant, passengers stiffening, gasps escaping in hushed disbelief. Someone swore under their breath. A woman in the second row clutched her pearls, her eyes darting between Marlene and Clarissa with horror. A businessman near the aisle muttered, "Oh, you've got to be kidding me." Clarissa stood frozen, her breath coming too fast, her brain scrambling to process. The pilot straightened, his voice tight with barely restrained panic. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said, the respect in his tone a sharp contrast to the way she had been spoken to all flight, "is the founder and chairwoman of this airline." Clarissa's heart stopped. The security officer stiffened, stepping away from Marlene as if proximity alone could ruin them. The passengers who had laughed at her, mocked her, suddenly looked like they wanted to disappear into their seats. Clarissa felt her throat tighten, her limbs turning cold. This wasn't possible. It wasn't real. But the way everyone was looking at her, the way the captain had reacted, the way Marlene sat there, perfectly composed, it was real. And she had just spent hours tearing down the most powerful woman in the airline industry. Marlene finally spoke, her voice calm, precise. "I believe you were about to have me removed from my own plane." Clarissa's lips parted, but no sound came out. Clarissa felt the weight of every stare in the cabin, her breath shallow, her pulse hammering against her ribs. The silence was crushing, a void filled only by the low hum of the aircraft. Marlene hadn't moved, hadn't raised her voice, hadn't even needed to demand justice. Yet justice was already coming for her. The intercom crackled to life. "This is Captain Reynolds." The pilot's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. "We have an urgent matter that requires immediate attention." The connection cut off just as quickly, but the damage was done. Clarissa turned, gripping the back of a seat for balance, her vision tunneling as she saw Sasha, the junior flight attendant, staring at her in horror. Sasha took a slow step back. "They're going to fire you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the murmurs spreading through first class. Clarissa's mouth opened, a sharp denial on the tip of her tongue, but the way the passengers were looking at her now, like she was filth, like she wasn't worth the air in this cabin, killed the words before they formed. The security officers, who had been ready to remove Marlene, now stood frozen, their expressions blank masks, waiting for orders. Then, through the overhead speakers, the voice of an airline executive came through, crackling with finality. Miss Vaughn is hereby suspended from duty, effective immediately. Clarissa's breath hitched. No, she muttered, shaking her head. No, wait. The pilot stepped forward, his tone devoid of sympathy. Miss Vaughn, you are no longer authorized to perform duties on this flight. Step away from the passengers and return to the galley. A few gasps rippled through the cabin. A businessman who had laughed at Marlene earlier averted his eyes, unwilling to be associated with a now disgraced flight attendant. A woman clutched her designer purse, as if Clarissa's downfall was contagious. Clarissa turned, desperate, searching for support. None came. Sasha was looking at her like she was a cautionary tale, one wrong move away from being erased herself. The security officers had stepped back, distancing themselves from her mess. And Marlene was simply watching, calm, composed, powerful, like a queen deciding the fate of a peasant who had dared overstep. The landing was the longest of Clarissa's life. The passengers, no longer whispering about Marlene, were whispering about her. She felt their eyes crawling over her skin, felt their judgment pressing into her spine. Every bump in the descent made her stomach turn, every shift in altitude a countdown to the end of everything. When the wheels finally touched the runway, Clarissa gripped the seat beside her, her fingers white with tension. A second later, a voice came over the intercom. Cabin crew, please remain seated. Except she wasn't cabin crew anymore. The doors opened. Clarissa forced herself to stand, to smooth her uniform, to pretend she still had control. But then she saw them, two uniformed officers, waiting just outside the gate, their eyes locked onto her. A collective inhale swept through first class. A passenger whispered something, barely suppressing a smile. Clarissa's knees nearly buckled. She turned, desperate, one last time, to Sasha, to the passengers, to anyone who might save her. No one did. She was alone. She had been alone the whole time. One of the officers stepped forward. Clarissa Vaughn? Clarissa's throat tightened. Yes, she managed, barely above a whisper. You are to come with us. Clarissa forced a laugh, sharp and brittle. Are you kidding me? You can't. We can, the officer interrupted. And we will. A hand landed on her arm. Not rough, but firm, final. The reality crashed over her like a wave. Clarissa Vaughn, who had strutted through this cabin like she owned the air itself, was being escorted off the plane like a criminal. And as she was led past first class, past the passengers she had once controlled, manipulated, humiliated, she caught a final glimpse of Marlene. Clarissa walked through the terminal, escorted by security, her uniform stiff against her skin, the weight of every step heavier than the last. The murmurs followed her, curious glances, hushed whispers, the occasional click of a phone camera capturing her disgrace. The first-class passengers had disembarked before her, moving through the airport like they still belonged, while she was dragged forward like an afterthought, a warning, a mistake that no one would make again. At the security checkpoint, a supervisor approached, tablet in hand, his face unreadable. He glanced at the officers, then at Clarissa. Miss Vaughn, your employment with the airline has been terminated effective immediately. Your access to all airline properties is revoked. You are barred from reapplying or working in any capacity within our aviation network. Your flight privileges are also permanently revoked. Clarissa's breath caught. Wait, the supervisor continued, unmoved. This includes commercial, private, and partner airline travel. As of now, you are banned from flying indefinitely. The words knocked the air from her lungs. Flying had been her life. It wasn't just a job, it was who she was, the very foundation of her existence. The uniform, the authority. The world above the clouds where she had once dictated who mattered and who didn't, it was all gone. her hands clenched at her sides. You can't do that." But the supervisor was already walking away because there was nothing left to discuss. Clarissa stood there, trapped in a moment that stretched endlessly, as the reality of her exile settled over her like a burial shroud. Somewhere across the airport, reporters were gathering. The news had already broken. The scandal had spread faster than turbulence in a storm, and every headline carried her name, but not in the way she had ever imagined. Flight attendant humiliates airline CEO, gets fired mid-flight. Power trip gone wrong. Clarissa Vaughn's career ends in disgrace. Marlene Hargrove speaks out. Airline implements zero-tolerance policy. Clarissa turned, half-dazed, and saw her. Marlene Hargrove stood at the far end of the terminal, surrounded by executives and press, her presence commanding but effortless. The woman who had been mocked, belittled, stripped of dignity now stood untouched, untarnished, as the world turned against the one who had tried to destroy her. A reporter's voice cut through the noise. "Mrs. Hargrove, can you comment on the incident?" Marlene adjusted her cuffs, her voice smooth but unwavering. "No one has the right to decide who deserves respect based on their age, appearance, or assumptions. That's why, as of today, we are implementing strict policies to remove individuals who abuse their position of power." Her gaze flicked, just briefly, toward Clarissa. "This industry will be cleaned from the inside out." Clarissa staggered back. Everything was over, and Marlene hadn't even needed to raise her voice. The final blow was delivered calmly, professionally, publicly, ensuring that Clarissa Vaughn would never work in aviation again. Clarissa turned, pushing through the crowd, ignoring the stares, the cameras, the unrelenting realization that she had built her own downfall with her own hands. She had ruled the skies. Now, she couldn't even board a plane. The end. If you enjoyed this epic karma-filled story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more. What was the most satisfying moment for you? Did Clarissa deserve even worse? And where are you watching from? Comment below.